All right, so now let's get into some of the meat of the different drive blocks in these basic amp preset layouts. Everything's going to start with an input which has a noise gate on it. That should keep your signal dead quiet. And this is where you set it. There are different channels of it. So if you're maybe on the gained scene, for example, the noise gate will change to B because the amp's getting noisier and louder. So you can adjust that there if you want, but that's what that does. Really important, there's an empty space right here, and then for some presets, if you want to add a pitch block for any reason, in terms of affecting the overall, like tune your bass down to E flat, you know, a little iffy, you're probably on an FM3, but you always want to put your pitch block first. That's why there is specifically a empty slot right here for you to do that. It's going to work better there. If you're doing things like a detune or things like that, you can add it back here later in the wet section, but this is normally where you'd put it, and that's why that's empty. Then the first main thing here after that is the compressor. And these are pedal compressors. Now, what are we doing with these pedal compressors? I'm going to probably have to talk a lot about what compression is or isn't, because a lot of people get confused about how it's used. There's a lot of different applications for compressors. And these presets have two compressors, one in the front of the signal and one in the back of the signal, and they do different things. I'm not trying to use a compressor to add sustain. That's not what we're doing with the compressor. What we're trying to do with the compressor here is we are trying to make sure that we have a consistent and more level signal going into the amplifier. And what I mean by that is, if you think about maybe your lowest E being really loud and maybe a high note on a D string on a bass being less loud, what compressors do based on how much compression you do is they will compress the signal like this, so that, you know, the loudest signal will get quieter and then the quieter signal will get louder. Okay, it's compressing the dynamic range, but then you can turn the overall signal up. That's the key concept a lot of people don't understand when you do that. And it also, you can control when the compressor kicks in and doesn't. So I may have confused you more. We'll talk more about it later when we get to the post-cab compressor, which is really important. But what I've got here is I've got a pedal compressor just like you'd have on a board for bass. And it's basically on, and it's sort of smoothing out the fact that low notes and high notes would have different volumes and trying to make them more of a consistent volume leaving the compressor. And this one, A, is set for fingers, playing bass with your fingers. B has a slower attack time, and so that's when you want to use a pick. So it's going to let the pick get through before the compressor goes in. It won't chop the pick off. So if you play pick all the time, you're going to want to set this compressor up to B on all the times, on all these that you use. It's going to default to A unless there is a specific, and there is for the Ampegs, some specific pick presets. You see these? Pick right here. So those are specific pick types of presets right in here. But the others are all default to the finger setting of the compressor. Now, you're not limited to those two kinds of compressors. I've got an optical compressor in here as well that's set that you can play with if you want, with the slower attack if you use, you know, a pick for that. And I think there's another or a similar version of that in here. So, yeah. So anyway, so you've got, that's what the compressor is. That's the function of it. And then we've added a couple of cool things here. We've got a phaser block that's off, but we've got 4 different kinds of phasers. There's a Mutron in here, there's a 2-Rock, there's a Script 90, there's the Ultra Super Mega Phaser from Fractal, so that's kind of fun. And then there's a drive block, and this is more of the distortion fuzz kinds of drives. There's a black glass in here. There is a ruckus that I use for distortion. There is a face fuzz, which is very useful for adding some, particularly for classic sounds. And then there's also a pi fuzz that I've also done some interesting adjustments on from time to time, boost the mids, etc. All right, now there's a filter block, and the filter block is off as well, but it's useful You can use the filter block to add a little bit of 700 hertz to your bass signal, and that will punch your bass signal out a little bit. That's kind of a magic frequency. It's adding 6 dB of that when that's on. Kind of a boost. There are a couple of other filter blocks here. This one is a tilt EQ that will take whatever sound you have. If your sound is too bright and trebly and not enough bottom, hit this filter block B, and it will cut the highs and raise the lows. Number C is the opposite. It's a tilt the other way. If your thing is too bassy and not enough high end, and this all happens right around 700, it'll flip it the other way. So you've got some options to sculpt your tone a little bit depending on what kind of bass you use. The last thing in here is a envelope triggered Q drive, sort of like a Bootsy Collins or something like that. So as you play, this will move in response to how you play on it. So there is an envelope filter built into the filter itself. Last, before the amp, and before the amp thing, there's a drive that I only use A and B for. And if you're on the Axe FX3, I think this drive block, in addition to these, have changed a little bit under firmware 14, so you might have to adjust it a little bit. And when I do the update, I will adjust it so it's the same. But this is kind of what gives you the warm sound and the driven sound, is this micro boost. It's just a very small boost. There's a slightly larger one here going into the amp. This works really great for things like single coil, like jazz basses. So what you're going to find is when you go from clean to the scene, from clean to warm, this drive is going to kick on. And then when you go to driven, it's going to get, gain, it's going to go off. And then when you go to driven, it's going to come back on. And it's going to introduce a tonal variation to it. So it's not just the amp moving around. The amp doesn't really have 4 settings necessarily. The drive is kind of making that little extra difference there. So be aware of that. All right, amp block. We got all kinds of things going on in the amp block. Here's a pi watt that I've got set up. I don't fool with the dynamics of the output compressor. I rarely fool with any of these kinds of things. I leave them to be stock. I make sure that the speaker impedance curve is matching whatever kind of speaker I'm using in most cases. If it's a 4x10, a 4x12, there happens to be a high watt speaker thing in here. But one thing I do on the preamp page is I do put a value in for the boost that is kicked in, and just like in the naked amps and the Live Gold TonePack, I am using the fractal control switches here to control amp functions. So input boost is going to be control switch 2, and on the FM3 there is a way to create a layout page, and we'll walk through that. As well as if you have an OMG9 set up with the FC6, or if you have an Axe FX3 and you have an FC6 or an FC12, you'll be able to boost your amp going into this. You also have a low cut. If it's too much bass, Control 6 will work on that. There's a fat switch, which is really useful for some amps like the Mesa Boogies. And then there's a bright switch. In this particular one, I've left it on. I haven't attached it. Sometimes I don't attach them because they will vary by the kind of amp sound I'm using, but usually they're attached. Unlike Live Gold and Dream Rigs, I did not use the saturation at all in any bass amps, because saturation kind of smears the sound, and that's not what you want with the bass, in my judgment. If you decide you want to do a saturation switch, you can assign it to Control Switch 5, and then you're going to have to dial this saturation drive back, or it might distort. You have to figure out where it needs to go. But I don't use it for these presets, so just be aware. It's not a mistake. That's just the way I've done it. And then, like most of my things, when you change scenes, usually the channel is going to change with it, of the amp. Notice when I went to scene 3, it goes to C. Scene 4 will go to D. The same thing will usually happen with the cab. When we do that, scene 4 will be D, scene 1 will be A, so that they all line up, and that lets you experiment a little bit as well. So let's talk about cabs, user cabs. Now you'll notice in some of these presets, you're going to see this symbol here where it says UCab with little up thing. That means there's a user cab that has to be used to make that work. In this case, it's the 8x10 Dr. Bonkers Marshall mix. If I'm going to go to this preset now, if you don't install these user cabs, it's going to show whatever you have in user 61, which will be the wrong cab. Remember how we installed these before? It's picking them up. You just have to install them once, and then everything else is going to line up directly, and they'll fit in there perfectly. They'll always be in cab left, and then cab right's always going to be flat. And the reason for that, again, is our scene thing. Right now, it's going to, this volume thing's going to make this mono, and it's going to come to the middle, even though it's panned here. Whenever we use scenes 1 through 4, and then when we go watch to scene 5, the volume pan goes off, and you'll see here. So this is going to be on the left output, and the other one's going to be on the right output. So going into the cab block, I do monkey with the cabs. I will add proximity sometimes. I will do a little low cut usually around here, and maybe play with the filter slope. Usually there's nothing under 42 that's really bass. That's more kick drum than anything. And I don't really add air for bass. I do align though, so there's no phase issues. You're going to love this. And we use the phase goinometer to check all this. But when you have these side by side on faders on different tracks, some people worry about, am I going to have phase issues? No, we've taken care of that by aligning everything in here for you. So a good thing to have. All right, the volume we talked about before, and all that is a summing thing. That's all it does. Again, we've talked about this being the PEQ for 5. We'll turn those on through 8. So it's taking a tap after the compressed signal. And this is just right your bass direct. It's just a bass DI. And there's a little volume level here added. PEQ coming off of that you can add. And here, if you want, you can tailor your bass amp DI sound. You've got some options to do that in different frequencies. That's why I wanted to use a PEQ. There's a little bit of gain here. No big deal, but that should work pretty well. And there's a little bit of a blend. Some of these, the volume may not be perfectly 10 based on what's going on in it, so just know that in advance. There is a little bit of that. You can always go in here and change this if you think your DI is too hot. That's one way to do it, but that's where you can adjust a DI blend this way as opposed to being at a DAW or a fader. So anyway, useful to know. Now we go to the send and then the return, and just notice that I have a 1 dB output level here. I just like that. You can change that if you want. But remember, this is on the AxeFX Edit 3 version. The return's going to be over here, and they'll give you some space if you wanted to add wet effects. But remember, if you've got outboard gear, if you've got a compressor that you like at home, you can use this send and come out of your FM3 or AxeFX3 and go to that outboard gear and return back in here. So it's your effects loop. So that lets you do that. Okay? All right, on the compressor, I spent a lot of time with this. This is really being used as more of a limiter than a compressor. When it's going to take these signals coming in, whether it's going to be off right now for scenes 1 through 4. You certainly can turn it on. You can set it up on your foot switch to do that. It'll be more of a good limiter, and it will automatically be on for scenes 5 through 8. And I have a couple of different kinds of compressors that I use here, and I've tweaked those. What's nice on the AxeFX3 version is you can actually see a visual graph here. There's not enough CPU on the FM3. When you play, you can actually see where the neck hits in, but I've set these up. To me, this is kind of an emulation of an 1176, which is one of my favorite compressors. I've set this up to be like that. I've made it a peak compressor. And again, I'm not trying to get sustain here. I'm not trying to squash it heavy. It should not show a lot of gain reduction except for sort of heavy notes, and maybe only down to 2 or 3 dB. That's all you're doing, is you're limiting it as you play to try and just smooth the signal out leaving the unit. So there's an 1176 there. There's an analog compressor equivalent that also sounds very good. Works very well. There's kind of a tube, and again, I'm trying to go for maybe a Fairchild type thing here. I've got a really long release on this one, for example, and then an optical in here. So I've made some adjustments here based on what I kind of know that's out there, but you can definitely do those to taste.